All right, welcome to another IAEI News Live. Today's discussion, we're going to continue on our discussion, our journey around panel boards. We're going over about 7 different cycles from 2002 to current date, National Electrical Code, Article 408, and it all starts now. All right. Well, welcome to IAEI News Live. My name is Thomas Dimitrovich, and yes, today we're going to talk about panel boards. We're going to continue our discussion on panel boards, and we're going to take a look at the changes. I thought would be really interesting is just to take a look at the code changes from the 2002 code, National Electrical Code, to today. So that's about 18 years, and if I throw in 1999 to 2002, there's 21 years of panel boards, and we're going to hit it in about an hour. So I'm going to see how well I do. All right. Why did I start with the 2002 version of the National Electrical Code? The reason I started there was because it was in the 2002 version of the NEC that we first had the movement of what used to be in the 99 code and previous editions used to be 380, I think it was 385. I'm gonna double check my knowledge here. 384 was panel boards and switchboards, and I'm gonna go back in time a little bit. Here's 1947. 1947, if I look at 336, 373 was cabinets, 380 was switches. Look at this, 384 was panel boards and switchboards. And 384, Article 384, so 384 even back in the 1947 code book, we had Article 384 switchboards and panel boards. And the scope was the requirements of this article shall apply to all switchboards, panel boards, and distribution boards used for the control of light and power circuits, except switchboards in utility company operated central stations and or substations, which directly control energy derived from the generators or transforming devices, and except switchboards or portions thereof used exclusively to control signal circuits operating by batteries. The requirements of this article shall apply to battery charging panels if current is taken from light or power circuits. So this is the 1947. Let's go back to even 23. 1923, this is the 23 code book. Let's take a look. Man, we're getting back here now. 801, 611, 606, 503. Let's take a look. Let's see, 402. Article 4. Article 4. 404 was services. I don't find panel boards in here. And there's services. Chapter 3. There's Chapter 3. Outside work. Chapter 3 was outside work on poles. Article 2 was general requirements. I don't even think they had a definition. They had a definition of a switchboard and a panel board in Article 1. Man, we're going well beyond our capabilities here. Let's see, take a look. Enclosed fuses was in Article 8. Cabinets and cutout boxes was in Article 7. So I guess 1940s, 1930s. I don't know. I'm not going to go to 53 because we're just getting ridiculous. All right, so panelboards and switchboards. We're going to start in the 2000. I'm going to put the 99 code to the side down here. And I'm looking at the 2002 version of the National Electrical Code. And we're going to start in Article 408 and take a look at some of the significant changes that have occurred over this span of about, I don't know, about 18 years, something like that. So 18 years ago, 19 years ago, in the 2002 version of the National Electrical Code, we saw some changes in 408.4. I grab my 99 code book too, because here's a suggestion for you. Now, we can go out, and I do have all the ROPs and ROCs associated with each of these years. But in 384, I'm going to look at 408.4, and I'm going to go to 384. 384-4, because remember, the 2002 code book is when we first started using dots instead of dashes. 384-4 was installation, and there was only a fine print note. There was no requirement. It just said 384-4, installation, period. Fine print note. For the dedicated space requirements, see section 110.26F, which brings up a good point. Although we are in 408 of the National Electrical Code, we've got to remember that chapter 1 still applies, and 110 is an important article, and I think as we go through our journey on 408 with panelboards, we're going to take a look and we're going to see 110.16, which talks about arc flash labels. That came in. We'll find out what code version it came into play, and some of the controversy around that and what it drove, which was the 2002 version. But in any case, let's take a look. Let's take a look at the 2002 version, because here's what I'm learning, that changes in other areas of the National Electrical Code raise awareness of safety concerns that drive changes in other areas of the National Electrical Code. So if we go to 110 and 110.16, flash protection, this was the first introduction for arc flash labeling in the National Electrical Code. Now, when you look at the 99 code, we were in 384. If I looked at the ROPs and ROCs for the 2002 version of the National Electrical Code, all the public inputs, all the public comments were around Article 384, which was the panelboards and switchboards coming off of the 99 code and coming into the 2002 code cycle. It was not the moving and creating Article 408, moving it from 384 to 408 was not something that the code making panel 9 voted on. Moving it from the 99 from 384 to 408 had to have been done by the Correlating Committee. And if you think about Chapter 3, what's the title of Chapter 3? Chapter 3 is Wiring Methods and Materials. So up until the Correlating Committee decided during the 2002 code cycle, up until that point, panelboards and switchboards, or switchboards and panelboards, were considered a wiring method and material. During the 2002 code cycle, we had a lot of discussion and debate in Article 110. I mean, it generated a lot of angst amongst manufacturers and others. There were battles from the annual meeting at the floor. There were debates and arguments at the code panel, many articles written around this. In fact, if you go to IAEI News website, IAEI magazine, I believe it was in, if you go to IAEI magazine and you can go to magazine archives on the IAEI's website. So let's do this. If you, just thought I'd throw myself in there. So if you go to the magazine, so I'm at IAEImagazine.org, and if you look, you'll see where it says current issue and then past issues. And you got the 2018 archive, the 2017 archive. And look at this. This is just absolutely phenomenal. We can go back to the 2002 archive. And what's interesting about this is you can take a look at each of the editions of the IAEI magazine and look at what was being talked about. And you know, when you read the IAEI magazine, you're going to see items of discussion with regard to inspections, enforcement, proper application of electrical equipment, proper application of the National Electrical Code, and any of those hot topics. So I'm just going to do, I'm going to open each of these in a separate window. And I'm right mouse clicking on each of the links, and you'll notice across the top. So this is January of 2002, high voltage, understanding the Canadian electrical code, dedicated equipment space, provisions in the NEC covering dedicated equipment space, because we know dedicated equipment space is going to impact panelboards and switchboards. Why? Because we need space for the electrical worker, a circuit breaker or not a circuit breaker. Thus is the question. And that was Andrew. Corner grounded Delta Systems. Let's take a look at March and April 2002. Oh, we got ASCIs. ASCIs. There's still a debated topic. Overcurrent protection and the NEC. Let's take a look at May, June. Now, May, June of 2002. May, June of 2002. This is after. Would be after the. Yeah, here's one here. Arc flash protection in 2002 NEC. I knew it had to be something. So this was Michael Callanan. I remember Michael Callanan at the time was an IBEW. I believe he was the IBEW rep. We can double check. I know he was, I don't know if he was on panel 9 or not. Who was the IBEW? Paul Welnick was on panel 9. Paul Welnick was on panel 9 for IBEW, and Jerome Siegel was the alternate. I'm just looking at who the panel 9 members were. But so arc flash protection in the 2002 NEC. So this was again a controversial topic, and Ray Jones was the submitter that started and kicked this off. And so you'll see articles in the history. So what I wanted to do is just basically point out to you, look, when you're thinking about history with regard to the National Electrical Code, you can't leave out those historical magazine articles from IAEI News. And if you're a member of the IAEI, you have access and you will get a magazine when they come out. And this is a really important, I think, part of your value of your membership. So think about in the 2002 cycle, a lot of controversy, a lot of discussion around arc flash reduction, and the requirements that went in 110. Probably bubbled that up to the correlating committee and people arguing and debating. And somebody asked the question, well, why is it in Chapter 3 anyway? Why are panel boards and switchboards in Chapter 3? It's really should be a Chapter 4, which is, take a look at the title. It's equipment. It's basically your general equipment for general use. So it's more of an equipment than it is a wiring method or a wiring method or material. So in any case, the correlating committee moved it to Article 408. Now, we didn't have in the 99 code in 380, I gotta open up my 384 panel boards and switchboards. So if I look at the 2002 version, 408.4 circuit directory. Did we have a circuit directory in 384? I do not believe we did. Circuit direct terminals, high leg, overheating, panel boards. We did not have, we had classification of panel boards. We had lighting and appliance branch circuits, number of overcurrent devices, switchboards. So we didn't have a 408.4 circuit directory. It was new in the 2002 version. And it said all circuits and circuit modifications shall be legibly identified as to purpose or use on a circuit directory located on the face or inside of the panel door in the case of a panel board and each switch on a switchboard. So this was new during the 2002 version of the National Electrical Code. And that would have been, remember, that would have been, if you're looking at the ROPs and ROCs, it would have been still in Article 308. I'm just checking the ROP to see if I have circuit directory in here. Yeah, 384-4 circuit directory. That was Joseph Tedesco, Joe Tedesco. You probably know his name, or you may or may not know his name. I don't know. I know Joe Tedesco. His except in principle, delete the last sentence of existing 384-13. So if you go to 384-13, that's where they got it from. So 408.4 circuit directory, if you look at the previous edition in 384-13, panel boards, the last sentence says, all panel board circuits and circuit modifications shall be legibly identified as to the purpose or use on a circuit directory located on the face or inside of the panel doors. So what Joe Tedesco was saying, look, let's just take it out of the last sentence of 384-13. Let's make it a requirement in 408.4, which would have been 384.4 then, and put it in what's the significance there? The significance is that 384-13 was in panel boards, which is back then you had man, it's amazing that when you look at different years, you had A was part, what we know as part 1, part 2, part 3. In the 99 code, it was part A, B, and C. So part C was panel boards. So they did a couple things. They moved it to part A, which is general. And remember, general would apply to all switchboards and panel boards. So what they did was they took this circuit directory marking requirement out of a section that only applied to panel boards, created its own section in part 1, and remember the 2002 code style manual took out parts, took out the A's, the B's, and made them part 1s and part 2s. So they put that in 408.4, which meant that switchboards and panel boards had to be marked with a circuit directory. So that expanded that requirement, and they took it, and Mr. Tedesco took that out. And then the panel statement was accept in principle, delete the last sentence of existing 384-13, and delete the fine print note. And then they revised it and they moved it to 384-4. The panel statement was the revised wording meets the intent of the submitter and provides clarity. Wow, they didn't really even justify moving it to. Now, the substantiation of the submitter was this will provide a new rule that will ensure proper marking of circuits and strengthen the rule found in 110-22. This new rule will also make use of the NEC more friendly. And I would argue that it probably expanded the circuit directory. But in any case, that's all I have to say about that. All right, so 408.4 was a big change. Take a look. I had written down some too. 408.14 was another change. I'm not sure if it was a big change. 408.14, classification of panel boards. Classification of panel boards. Let's take a look at this one. This was IAEI, the Andrew Criswelli, representative of the NEC chapter. NEC, email. 408.14, classification of panel boards. And it looks like classification of panel boards. So the panel action was accept to revise existing section 384-14. So 384-14 was in existence. And it was classification of panel boards, and it was kind of short in the 99 code. It said panel boards shall be classified for purposes of this article as either lighting and appliance branch circuit panel boards or power panel boards. And they made some modification. This says, based on their content, a lighting and appliance branch circuit is a branch circuit that is connected to a neutral of a panel board that has overcurrent protection of 30 amps or less in one or more conductors. So they added some clarity to 408.14. I don't think earth-shattering, but just added some clarity. Another change, 408.16. 408.16 was overcurrent protection, and B was power panel board production, or power panel board protection, not production, protection. And I believe it was new. That was a new section in 384 in the 99 code. I'm not going back further than that. And they just tweaked it a little bit for this code cycle, so I don't think it was anything. And there's the rated 30 amps or less. So a similar change that we saw in 408.14. 10% of its overcurrent devices protecting branch circuits rated 30 amps or less shall be protected by an overcurrent protective device. The overcurrent protective device shall be located within or at any point of the supply side of the panel board. So they just added some clarity to that section, not earth-shattering. 408.21, grounded conductor terminations. Each grounded conductor shall terminate within the panel board in an individual terminal that is not also used for another conductor. And let's take a look at that. Did not exist in the previous cycle, and they have an exception. So 408.21, let's just take a look at the ROPs and see if any change was in the ROP. Grounded conductor terminations. All right, so grounded conductor, this came from Mr. Jim Pauley. Add a new section to read substantiation was the revision is needed to coordinate. This revision is needed to coordinate the installation requirements with a long-standing product standard requirement. Remember, a panel board is listed to UL 67, so he's quoting from a clause 12.3.10 of UL 67, where it states, an individual terminal shall be provided for the connection of each branch circuit neutral conductor. He says this requirement has been enforced in the past by a close review of the manufacturer's markings and NEC 110-3B. So this was more of a 110-3B requirement. However, since it is a rule that specifically affects how the installer can make connections, it is important that it be in the NEC. And I would assume that outside of 110-3B. So he says, even with the manufacturer's markings, inspectors will indicate that they see a number of panel boards installed with two branch circuit neutrals under one terminal, or they see an equipment grounding conductor and neutral under the same terminal. There's very good rationale for the requirement in the product standards. Doubling up on the neutrals creates a significant problem when the circuit needs to be isolated. In order to isolate the circuit, the branch breaker is turned off and the neutral is disconnected by removing it from the terminal. If the terminal is shared with another circuit, the connection to the other still energized circuit will be loosened as well. This can wreak havoc, particularly if the neutral is part of 120/240 volt multi-wire branch circuits. Also, the neutral assemblies are not evaluated with doubled up neutrals on the terminals. So this is, I mean, and I've always asked, I have had this same question in the past, and you wonder, why did this go in? Why don't I put more than one under that neutral? Here it is, right here. This is where it's at. And this is the May 2001 ROP, which is available as a free download off of the NFPA website. The connection of a neutral and equipment grounding conductor creates a similar issue. One of the objectives of the particular arrangement of bonding jumpers, neutrals, and equipment grounds is to allow circuit isolation while keeping the equipment grounding conductor still connected to the grounding electrode. And they is referencing UL 896A, the reference standard for service equipment. When the neutral is disconnected, the objective is to still have the equipment ground solidly connected to the grounding electrode. If both the neutral and grounded conductor are under the same terminal, this cannot be accomplished. He thought this one out. This addition to the NEC does not change any product or permitted wiring arrangement from what it is today. It will, however, help installers to avoid wiring the panel in violation of 110-3B and then have to contend with a red tag from the inspector. All right, so and you can read the rest of that one. I'm not, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read the rest of that one, but that's why we've got the grounded conductor terminations in 40821. Each grounded conductor shall terminate within the panel board on an individual terminal that is not also used for another conductor. The reason is what I just read. Now that's a good one. Take that one to the bank. All right, so now I'm done with the 99 code. So you see how to handle some of this. What I like, I'm just suggestion. This is just looking at two versions of the code. So it's important, if we're going to compare and try to understand what changed, you've got to have the old version and the new version open at the same time. All right, now that's the 2002. We're moving to the 2005 version of the National Electrical Code, and we're going to focus on Article 408, and we need our spectacles. 408. And I know all of you have a code library, probably a mile long, because we are code gurus, or code geeks, or code weenies. I've heard a lot of different terms used. All right, gotta coffee up. Coffee. Or tea. All right, so let's take a look at the 2005 version of the National Electrical Code, Article 408. This article covers the following. Okay, so what did we change? Circuit directory or circuit identification. So 408.4, remember what we did in the last cycle, we moved it from we moved it from Part C, which was Part 3, which was panel boards, and we moved it over to Part 1, general, took it out of a sentence for panel board markings, moved it over to general requirements, now it impacts panel boards and switchboards. 408.4 still gets a little bit of love in the 2005 version. Now, remember 408.4 simply said all circuits and circuit modifications shall be legibly identified as to the purpose, blah, blah, blah. The identification shall include sufficient detail. All right. Here we go. Now we're getting into the details, because somebody said, hey, hold on. You isolated this, but what does it mean? Now they're saying the identification shall include sufficient detail to allow each circuit to be distinguished from all others. The identification shall be included in a circuit directory that is located on the face or inside of the panel door in the case of a panel board and located at each switch on a switchboard. You gotta love this stuff. All right, so things get blurry when I take these off. So we're looking for a little bit more detail in 408.4 in the 2005 code. Hold on. We got another change. 408.3. I progressed too quickly. 408.3c, used as service equipment, changed a little bit. And all sections of a switchboard shall be bonded together. So I think just some minor changes in, they added OR table 250.66. So you've got in accordance. So what they did here is this: all sections of a switchboard shall be bonded together using an equipment bonding conductor size in accordance with table 250.122. And that's where it stopped in the past. And now they added 250.66 or 250.66 as appropriate. Let's take a look. Remember what 250.66 was added. And let's take a look in 250, see if they made any changes and what would have prompted that. 250.66 was the grounding electrode conductor. So that did not change in this cycle. So they were just adding some clarity. So somebody said, hey, probably had a question in the field and said, you're forgetting about 250.66. So they picked it up. All right, so 408.3c, 408.4, we already talked about. 408.5. 408.5 also changed. 408.5, ooh, doggy. Well, there's a couple new sections that were added. 408.5 was added. Clearance for conductor entering bus enclosures, and 408.7, unused openings. So we're in the 2005. Now we have the introduction of the unused openings, and we have a 408.5, which is now clearance for conductors. And then the location of switchboards. So it looks like we did some reorganization. In part 2, switchboards, what used to be location of switchboards, now we have switchboards in damp and wet locations. And we have 408.17, location relative to easily ignitable material. Oh, yeah. So location of switchboards, 408.5 was sort of deleted. Yeah. So we don't have location of switchboards anymore. Switchboards that have exposed live ports shall be located in permanently dry locations, and then only where competent supervision and accessibility. So we've got some changes in part 2 for switchboards. And we've created a clearance for conductors, 408.5, where conduits or other raceways enter a switchboard floor, standing panelboard, or similar enclosure at the bottom, sufficient space shall be provided to permit installation of conductors and enclosures. And we have the clearance for conductors, table 408.5. That was 408.10. So what they did was they took clearance for conductors entering bus enclosures, and they moved it from 408.10, which is switchboards, and they moved it to 408.5. So it moved it out of part 2 and put it into part 1. So it's not necessarily a new section. It's just relocated. They relocated 408.5. Now, unused openings, I believe that is new. Unused openings is new for the 2005 version of the NEC. So that's that would be a new section. So 408.7 is new. Unused openings for circuit breakers and switches shall be closed using identified closures or other approved means that provide protection substantially equivalent to the wall of the enclosure. So that's new for making sure you have those unused openings properly sealed. They relocated from switchboards into general requirements. Now, what does that do? What that does, whenever you move something from, say, you got to understand the architecture of the code. The parts give you general requirements in 408 would apply to anything that is covered by 408. Part 2 is titled switchboards. So any of the requirements in part 2 only apply to switchboards. They won't apply to, for example, panelboards, which is in part 3. It wouldn't apply to construction specifications in part 4. So what they did by moving something out of part of one of these parts and putting into the general requirements, that means it now applies to all of those items that are covered in 408, switchboards and panel boards. So the circuit directory, remember that moved. Clearance for conductors entering bus enclosures moved from switchboards over to general, so now it applies to panel boards as well. And then you have unused openings, so that doesn't matter if it's a panel board or a switchboard. Any unused opening in an Article 408 piece of equipment has to be closed based on the requirements for 408 to 7 using the right identified equipment. All right. Okay, 408. Now we're into 408.20, which is in Part 2, switchboards. 408.20, location of switchboards. All right. So location of switchboards. Interesting. So they moved 408.5. They moved 408.5 to 408.20. So it didn't move from switchboards to general requirements. It just, and they didn't delete it. They just moved it from 408.5 because 408.5 is now clearance for conductors, and they moved it to 408.20 probably because they needed another number. And let's take a look. You had 17, you have 18, you have 19. That's what they did. And then you had 22. So they said, hey, let's move it up there to 408.20. And it's the same requirement, just relocated to 408.20. So no big change there, just shifting some gears for you. We move things around in the code, very similar for the reasons manufacturers make print smaller, just to make your life more difficult. All right. Panel boards, 408.30 also looks like it changed in panel boards. Panel boards is part 3. So let's take a look at part 3, panel boards. We've got a 408.30, 408.30. Wow. Panel boards was 408.13. So they moved some stuff around. General requirements. Panel boards had a general requirements, but instead of 408.13, it's now 408.30. And I don't see any major changes. There's some slight changes, but I don't see anything major in that one. But fine print note is still the same. 408. And that's 408.30, which used to be 408.13. All right, and then 408.36 B and C. 408.36 is overcurrent protection, and that used to be 408.16, because remember, we shift a bunch of things around in 408. And 408. Wow, it saw some changes last cycle, and it's going to see some changes this cycle as well. 408.36 B is power panel board protection. In addition to the requirements of 408.30, a power panel board with supply conductors neutral having more than 10% of its overcurrent devices. You know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking that they changed some of the section numbers in here. Yep, I don't think they changed much at all. They changed a reference to a section number. So just adding some clarity to that section. And then 408.36C, snap switches, 30 amps or less. Panel boards equipped with snap switches rated 30 amps or less shall have an overcurrent protection of 200 amps or less. So they just changed the words. What it used to say was panel boards equipped with snap switches rated 30 amps or less shall have an overcurrent protection not in excess of 200 amps. And they just added clarity, it's 200 amps or less. So sometimes when some of the changes really aren't that significant and don't impact you all that much. But it is important to understand some of the nuances, because whenever they're adding clarity, that means that there was probably some confusion in the field. All right. And that's pretty much it for the 2005 version of the National Electrical Code. So that's what we're moving to. 2008. 2000. This is in the era of Thomas Dimitrovich. This was when I got into tabs. Look at all those beautiful tabs. I thought that was the cat's meow. I remember going to an IAEI meeting and I'm like, wow, I love the tabs because I'm a young and trying to learn the National Electrical Code and finding my way through. I was just impressed with how these inspectors could rattle off sections, and I figured it was because of the tabs. It wasn't because they used the code on a daily basis. It was because they bought the tabs. So I bought the tabs, and it didn't work for me. Anyway, we're in the 2008 now. So we moved 3 years ahead. We're going forward in time, and we're going to take a look at some of the changes. We had a change in 408.3. 408.3. So remember, that is general requirements. And we have a new requirement for high leg identification. It says bus arrangement. So we had phase arrangement in E. The old F was minimum wiring bending space. That was moved to G because they felt that we needed to put high leg. I don't know why. Before G, you would have thought they would have just created a new G and said high leg identification and kept F the same. No. We moved F to G, didn't change it other than the letter, and made this F, high leg identification. So this is the new requirement in the 2008 code. A switchboard or panelboard containing a 4-wire delta-connected system where the midpoint of one phase winding is grounded shall be legibly and permanently field marked as follows. Caution, whatever phase has whatever volts to ground. So raising awareness of that high leg and identifying it in the switchboard or panelboard. Because remember, this is in general requirements. This would apply to both switchboards and panelboards. We have a high leg identification requirement introduced in the 2008 version of the National Electrical Code. All right. And we would not be a code cycle without some more tweaks to 408.4 circuit directory or circuit identification. We said spare positions that contain unused overcurrent devices or switches shall be described accordingly. So now we got to identify those spare positions. Love this stuff. Gosh. And then we also said no circuit shall be described in a manner that depends on transient conditions of occupancy. So you can't say, for example, put on the panel board, Tom's room. What if Tom doesn't live here anymore? Or maybe Tom's guitar station. Well, what if Tom moves and his guitar station goes away? It's no longer a guitar station. So you want to identify things as bedroom 1, bedroom 2, bedroom 3, living room. Living room will be a living room will be a living room regardless of who lives there. It's not Tom's space. It's not Bobby Joe's space. So they wanted to add that clarity, and I'm sure there were examples for that. So 408.4 continuing to change. Now we go, nothing changed in switchboards. Status quo. Panel boards, though. Part 3, panel boards, got a little bit of love. 408.36, overcurrent protection. Now, in the previous code cycle, 408.36 overcurrent protection was separated into an A, a B, a C, a D, an E, an F, and it is still separated into A, B, C, and D, but there's no E anymore. And there's no F anymore. Oh wait, no, we got delta breakers is still there. That's an E. F is backfed breakers. That's still there. Supplied through a transformer is no longer there. And snap switches is still there. So they got rid of D. And they got rid of power panel board protection. And let's take a look at what they did. They they changed the parent text, and they didn't change it, they added parent text in 408.30.6. In addition to the requirements of 408.30, a panel board shall be protected by an overcurrent protected device having a rating not greater than that of the panel board. This overcurrent protected device shall be located within or at any point on the supply side of the panel board. So they took what was in B and A. They got rid of A. A said lighting and appliance branch circuit panel boards individually protected. This is where we said each lighting and appliance branch circuit panel board shall be individually protected on the supply side by not more than 2 main overcurrent devices. And they had 2 exceptions. Those exceptions, individual protection, they maintained those 2 exceptions. They combined A and B together. And it looks like they created parent text that addressed both A and B. And they kept the 2 exceptions, and then they added a 3rd exception because there were 2 exceptions under 408.36a, and there was 1 exception under 408.36b. And the B says, for existing panel boards, individual protection shall not be required for a panel board used as service equipment for an individual residential occupancy. For existing installations, individual lighting, appliance branch circuit panel boards shall not be required where panel boards are used. Okay, so it looks like they're removing the whole concept of lighting and appliance panel boards in this version of the NEC, because they don't reference lighting and appliance panel boards. They don't differentiate that any longer. So that's a change that occurred during this cycle. They maintained the protection. They reference 408.30. That's the general requirements for panel boards shall have a rating not less than the minimum feeder capacity, all that good stuff. They talk about the overcurrent protection. So I think the big change here is there's no longer a reference to lighting and appliance branch circuit panel boards. It's a panel board. Panel board is a panel board, whether it's serving lighting or any other type of load. This is what it is, and this is what it does, and this is what it shall be. All right, so that's the major change that they did there. They reorganized it. I don't know that they changed the intent all that much. I mean, you could make an argument about the lighting panel board or whatnot, but in reality, the panel board still needs to be protected. It's a panel board, whether it serves lighting loads or not. The exceptions are pretty much maintained, and clarity was added. They said exception number 2, individual protection. Exception number 2, individual protection shall not be required for a panel board protected on its supply side by 2 main circuit breakers or 2 sets of fuses, having combined ratings not greater than that of the panel board. A panel board constructed of or wired under this exception shall not contain more than 42 overcurrent devices. For the purposes of determining the maximum of 42 overcurrent devices, a 2-pole or a 3-pole circuit breaker shall be considered as 2 or 3 overcurrent devices respectively. So we got the 42 circuit rule. And I don't see that in panel boards. Yes, 408.35, number of overcurrent protected devices on board, no more than 42 overcurrent devices of a lighting. So 408.35. So they took 408.35. You gotta love this. 408.35, which was number of overcurrent devices on one panel board, was moved into 408.36. So they got rid of 408.35, merged it in with 408.36 as an exception. So panel boards got some love. They really did. So in the previous cycle, you had the general requirements, and then 408.34, which was classification of panel boards, was removed. So we got rid of classification. Panel boards shall be classified for the purposes of this article as either lighting and appliance branch circuit panel boards or power panel boards. They got rid of that reference. So 408.34, kaput, done, gone. No longer in the code, removed, kabitsko. erratico, done, moved out. 408.34 is out. 408.35, they said, you know what? We're going to work that into 408.36, and that's going to be a part of an exception. 408.36 changed. But really, I mean, if you really think about it, panelboard has to be protected at its ampacity. None of the basic fundamentals of panelboard protection changed. We changed some terminology. We removed some sections in the code, but we really didn't change the fundamental protection principles for a panelboard. We still have this applied through a transformer. That didn't change at all. The delta breakers, the backfed breakers. We addressed the lighting and appliance branch circuit panel boards, made some modifications, and condensed a couple sections into one section of the code with some exceptions. And we really didn't introduce anything that was earth-shattering, but I'm sure it got a lot of traction at a lot of meetings to help people understand what was going on in this 408.36. So before the 2008 version, we had lighting and appliance branch circuit panel boards. We had a classification of panel board section, and it was either a power panel board or a lighting and appliance panel board. We don't have those designations anymore in the 2008. It is a panel board, period. And you got to protect it. And that, I think, is the story for the 2008 version of the National Electrical Code. You've got to love this. And then in part 4, construction and specification, maximum number of overcurrent protective devices. A panel board shall be provided with a physical means to prevent the installation of more overcurrent protective devices than that number for which the panel board was designed, rated, and listed. For the purposes of this section, a two-pole circuit breaker or a fusible switch shall be considered 2 overcurrent devices. So, another big change. Think about what we just did. Remember what we had in 408.35. We had not more than 42 circuits. The 2008 version of the code removed the 42-second rule. Yes. The number of overcurrent devices in one panel board was at 408.35, and it said no more than 42. That was removed. And in part 4, we have a 408.54, maximum number of overcurrent devices. A panel board shall be provided with physical means to prevent the installation of more overcurrent devices than the number for which the panel board was designed, rated, and listed. So I can have a 42 circuit. I can have a 64 circuit. This was when we started to see the introduction of the more devices than 42 in a panel board. And I'll bet you, this is 2008, okay? So they'd also take a look at 408.55 wiring bending spaces. So think about, we have more conductors in a trough. What's going on in the 2008 version? They said, hey, we're going to do away with this, but we also had to take a look at the wire bending space and the exception. Either the top or bottom wiring bending spaces shall be permitted to be sized in accordance with Table 312.6A for panel board rated 225 amps or less and designed to contain not over 42 circuit devices. For the purposes of this exception, a 2-pole or 3. So there were wiring bending spaces changes that were made to address that increase in number of circuits that you can put in that panel board. And then they have panel boards shall be durably marked by the manufacturer with the voltage. This is in 408.58. So we have some additional marking requirements in 408.58. That was a new section. So big changes in the 2008 code with regard to panel boards specifically. Switchboards didn't get the love, but panel boards did. Yep, switchboards, not much love. Panel boards, we got rid of the 42 circuit rule in panel boards. 2011, 408. I'm still in the Dimitrovich era. We're still infatuated with tabs. I'm thinking it's working for me. 408. You gotta love this. You gotta love this stuff. 408 panel boards in the 11 code. Wow. Here's the big one. We changed the scope. Did we change the scope? Yes, we did. Bada bing, bada boom, bada bam. 408.1. This article covers switchboards and panel boards. It does not apply to equipment operating at over 600 volts. So the 2011, the 2008 version did not have a reference to 600 volts. Now they're saying, hey, wait a second. 408 doesn't apply to anything over 600 volts. All right. Switchboards and panel boards, we made some changes to other articles, some minor changes to other articles. Oh, yeah, you got to love this stuff. 408.3F, switchboard and panel board identification. We had the high leg. We added an ungrounded system. So we said, hey, you got the high leg marking that we introduced in the 8 code. What about the ungrounded system? So now it says a switchboard or panel board containing an ungrounded electrical system as permitted in 250.21 shall be legibly and permanently field marked as follows. Caution, ungrounded systems operating blank volts between conductors. So now we have a marking requirement for ungrounded systems on that equipment. 408.4, which was the circuit directory or circuit identification, now says 408.4 is field identification required. Field identification. Somebody probably somewhere said, hey, I can't mark this at the manufacturing facility. We got to do that in the field. And we said all switchboards and panel boards supplied by a feeder in other than 1 or 2 family dwellings shall be marked to indicate the device or equipment where the power supply originates. So we broke out a source of supply, and that was not in 408.4. And what does that do? That helps us understand where we have to go to establish an electrically safe work condition, right? The electrical worker has to establish an electrically safe work condition. We rely on one-line diagrams to do that. This marking requirement says I need to mark a panel board or a switchboard with which panel board or switchboard is supplying power to it, so that the electrical worker can go to that panel board to help establish an electrically safe work condition, which will include the lockout, tagout procedures, verification of absence of voltage, all that jazz. So that was in the general requirements. And space within enclosures, space within an enclosure containing a panel board, 408.55. This would have been in construction specifications. It used to say wire bending space in panel boards. Now it says wire bending space within an enclosure containing a panel board, which I love it. I just love this stuff. In the 2023 code cycle, we are recognizing that we're misusing the word panel board in many applications because, in the first video of this series, we discussed that a panel board is what's inside. It doesn't include the enclosure. So 408.55 is adding that clarity. But I would argue, if you go throughout the National Electrical Code, and we're going to try to clear this up, there are many, many, many instances of where we'll say, for example, the conductor should be within the panel board. The panel board is the bus structure within the panel board. What they mean is within the enclosed panel board, because you can't put something within a panel board, which is a bus structure. So we're adding that clarity. We're going to try to fix that. And it's interesting to see that in the 2011 NEC, some of that clarity began. All right. So that's the big changes. So 2011, I would say source of supply, adding ungrounded system, I think the marking of the panel board with the source of supply is probably the big earth-shattering change that was made in the 11 cycle. What comes after 11? 14, of course. And look, Tom is still in the tab mode. He is hot and heavy. He's like, man, these tabs are phenomenal. They're helping me find. I'm quicker. Maybe not as quick as Donnie Cook, but I am quicker. 408. Look at this. I'm going to use the tabs. 408, 430, 424, 410, 408 panel boards. Look, 408 is so important. It got its own tab. There it is. Got its own tab. All right. We're in the 14 code. This added. Okay, here we go. Look at this. Look. And my tab is almost ripped. So 408. I'm here to tell you that earth-shattering news 2014 code cycle, we added switchboards, switch gear, and panel boards. And I'll bet you if we go to Article 100, I remember these discussions. When we go to Article 100, I'll bet your bottom dollar we added a definition for switch gear. No, we added a definition for substation. An enclosed assemblage of equipment, switches, interrupting devices. I remember that. Switchboard, switch gear. Yes, we did. Look at that. We added a definition of switchgear in Article 100. An assembly completely enclosed on all sides and top with sheet metal, except for ventilating openings and inspection windows, and containing primary power circuit switching, interrupting devices, or both with buses and connections. The assembly may include control and auxiliary devices. Access to the interior of the enclosure is provided by doors, removable covers, or both. And there's an informational note that talks about NEC requirements as metal enclosed, switchgear related below 1,000 volts or less may be identified as low voltage power circuit breaker switchgear. Switchgears rated over 1,000 volts may be identified as metal enclosed switchgear or metal clad switchgear. Switchgear is available in non-arc resistant or arc resistant construction. So 408, we went from 600 volts to 1,000 volts. So in the 14 code, we added switchgear. We took 408.1 to 1,000 volts. What drove that? Photovoltaic systems going above 600 volts. Those boys and gals introduced 1,000 volts to everybody. And we're talking about going higher these days. So we added switchgear. So you'll see a lot of changes in this version of the code that added the term switchgear. And what they did was, obviously, they couldn't add it to Part 3, which is panel boards. They added it to Part 2, switchboards and switchgear. They didn't create a new part that just addressed switchgear because the requirements of switchboards are very similar. So you'll see they added switchgear to Part 2, and throughout the sections in Part 2, they added the term switchgear because they realized all of the requirements that are in 408.16 through 408.22, which apply to switchboards, also apply to switchgear. All right, so panel boards. 408.38 again. Remember, what is a panel board? A panel board is that internal structure that you push the breakers and mount the breakers to. 408.38 enclosure. Panel boards shall be mounted in cabinets, cutout boxes, or identified enclosures and shall be dead front. So they added identified enclosures. Protection of instrument. Okay, so they added some minor changes in construction to address switchgear. In construction as well, you got top and bottom wire bending space, side wire bending space, and back wire bending space. Remember, in some of these applications, you'll have the wire may come into different locations within the equipment, and they're addressing those different ways of intrusion or entering those panels. And that's pretty much the change in the 2014 code. Now, 2017 code for Dimitrovich is, I have no longer in the era of tabs. I was only into a tab environment for 3 code cycles. So that's 3, 6, 9 years of my code life. I needed the tabs. And I would say, I would argue I'm no longer a tab guy, but look, I decided to invent my own tabs. So I have all of my own tabs inside of my book. So I graduated from the purchasing the tabs to purchasing separate. I'm looking for these. So this I think somebody gave me these. Look at this. This is 2014. Yeah, 17 code. So this is I don't know, humming fashion. I don't know if my wife bought these for me, if I found them at a show. This is in 2014 is when I got these little things. It has a 2014 calendar. It's got all these arrows. So I got into the era of putting my own arrows and whatnot. So 408. Let's look at 408 as part of the 2017 code. 408. Service panel board switchboards. This is when we added panel boards to the line side barriers. So 17 code cycle is when we introduced the word panel boards to 408.3, which now required line side barriers for service overcurrent protection devices inside of a panel board. And we had the exception that it should not apply to panel boards that are utilizing the 6 disconnect rule, which elevated the awareness to code panel 10 that, hey, we have a problem with the 6 disconnect rule with 6 disconnects in a single panel board because we got this exposed bus. So this was the beginning of the journey of changes in 408 for panel boards around the 6 disconnect rule. We elevated the awareness of a problem in this section. All right, so we got labels. I'm just looking through the 17. I'd say that was the big change in the 17 code, was the line side barriers required as part of service panel boards, putting panel boards into 408.3a. All right, that's the 17 code. And then we get to the 2020 code in 408. And what you'll see is we said, look, in 408, we said, you know what? We need to move this, the requirements for line side barriers into 230, and we expanded the line side barriers in 230. And we made some, let's take a look at 408. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take the 2020 analysis of code changes book and take a look at what we said in chapter 4 in 408 to see what the big identified change is from the IAEI, which I know every one of you are a member of the IAEI. 408. Wow, we got a few changes here. All right, 408.8. Oh, 408.6. This was a big change. 408.6 now requires, this is short circuit current rating. New requirement added to 408, requiring available fault current and the date the calculation was performed to be field marked on the enclosure at the point of supply for switchboards, switchgear, and panel boards in other than dwelling units. Big change. Why is it going in there? Why do we have to mark the available fault current? Because we have to make sure that the short circuit current rating and interrupting ratings of the devices are adequate for the application. We can't do that without the available fault current. 408.8, reconditioned equipment. Big change in the 2020 National Electrical Code, identifying that switchboard, switchgear, and panel boards had to comply with 110.21a2 if reconditioned, but no provisions for reconditioning of switchboard, switchgear, and panel boards were found in Article 408. A new 408.8 was added to Article 408 to address reconditioning of switchboards, switchgear, and panel boards. Panel boards cannot be reconditioned, while switchboards and switchgear may be reconditioned, but you still have to follow the marking requirements in 110.21. So another big change, reconditioned equipment. Clearances, 408.18c, new provisions require switchboards and switchgear that requiring rear or side axis to be marked by the manufacturer on the front of the equipment, indicating rear or side access is needed. So if you need rear and side access, then you have to mark it on the front of the equipment. And also 408.3d was moved to a new 408.18c to intensify the requirement that grounded and grounding terminals be installed such that it is not necessary to reach across ungrounded bus or terminals to make the connections. And then you got 408.36. 408.36, exception number 1 was deleted as the exception was rendered obsolete. So that was the relation to the 6 disconnect rule. We deleted that exception because we changed the 6 disconnect rule in the 2020 code cycle. And that's a discussion for a different day. We also in the 2020 code said you can't put it in the face up position. And that was in response to some clothes or laundromat application equipment where they would put the panel board in the face up position, which was unsafe for the electrical worker. All right, that takes us through the 2020 code cycle. And I dropped my Keith Laughlin thinking pen. Sorry about that, Keith. All right, so we covered the Article 408 significant changes from the 2002, and I'd almost argue since the 1999 version of the National Electrical Code. I hope you got something out of this journey of a review of Article 408 significant changes. And if you've got questions on panel boards, switchboards, or switchgear, send them to IAEI and we will get those things answered for you if you want to understand better Article 408. And I think what we'll see from maybe the next session on panel boards, switchboards, and switchgear is maybe a presentation from the IAEI on panel boards, Article 408. So stay tuned for that one in the future. Thank you for spending an hour or so with me. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate what you do for the electrical industry. Don't forget, subscribe to our YouTube channel. There it is. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. And remember, IAEI membership has its advantages. So let's get out there. If you're not an IAEI member, look forward to hearing that you have become an IAEI member. Membership has its advantages. We are going to continue to grow this YouTube channel and other resources for all of the industry, and especially for the IAEI members with special features and special technical sessions only available to IAEI members in the future. So thank you, and thanks for all that you do for electrical safety, etc. And remember, stay safe and please stay healthy. Until next week, God bless. Take care.